The folks of Pine Bluffs liked their cruelty served with a smile and a Sunday sermon. So when Boone Jessup, a man who smelled of pine resin and old blood, dragged his boots into the mercantile and bought the debts of the blind widow, they didn't just whisper. They laughed. They figured a mountain savage and a broken woman would freeze before the first snow. They were wrong. Dead wrong. Because they didn't know what lived inside the dark of her eyes. Pine Bluffs was a town built on mud and broken promises. It sat in the valley like a rotten tooth, surrounded by jagged peaks that blocked out the sun by 3 in the afternoon. Boone Jessup hated the place. He only came down from the timberline twice a year, driven by the absolute necessity of coffee salt and black powder. He was a massive man, thick-shouldered and quiet. His buckskins were stained dark with grease and weather, and a thick, unruly beard hid most of his expression. He moved through the crowded streets with a heavy, deliberate gait. People stepped out of his way. They didn't like the mountain men. They liked their pelts and the coin they brought, but they despised the wildness they dragged in with them. Boone pushed open the heavy oak door of Cobb's Mercantile. The air inside was thick with the smell of cured tobacco, damp wool, and kerosene. He dropped his bundle of prime beaver and fox pelts onto the wooden counter. The dull thud echoed in the room. Elias Cobb, a thin man with a nervous twitch in his left eye, began sorting through the furs with greedy, hurried fingers. That was when Boone heard it. A quiet, steady tapping. He turned his head. In the corner of the store, near the sacks of flour and dried beans, stood a woman. She was wrapped in a faded grey shawl that offered no real protection against the mountain draft. Her posture was rigidly straight. In her right hand she held a smooth-peeled hickory stick. Clara Jensen. Boone knew of her, though they had never spoken. Everyone in the valley knew the story. Her husband Thomas had drowned in the icy rapids of the Snake River 3 years ago, leaving her with a patch of worthless rocky land on the edge of town. A fever took her sight a year later. The town pitied her at first. Pity, however, is a shallow well. When the pity dried up, it was replaced by irritation. She was a liability, a burden on the Christian charity of Pine Bluffs. Standing in front of her was Hiram Gable, the local bank manager. Gable was a soft man who wore expensive woolen suits and a perpetual sneer. "I'm telling you for the last time, Clara." Gable's voice was loud. He wanted an audience. "The grace period ended in October. You owe $60 on the deed. You don't have it. The bank is taking the land." Clara didn't flinch. Her eyes, pale and clouded over like frosted glass, stared straight ahead. "I have $20, Mr. Gable. I sold the last of the laying hens. I just need another month to secure the rest." "Secure it how?" Gable chuckled, looking around the store to ensure people were listening. A few men by the Cracker Barrel snickered. "You going to knit us some sweaters? You can't even see the yarn. It's done, Clara. Move into the church cellar. Reverend Miller said he'd lay out a cot for you. It's where you belong." Clara's knuckles went white around her hickory cane. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She just stood there, absorbing the humiliation. "That land is mine. Thomas and I bought it free and clear before the taxes went up. There is good timber there." "Timber you can't chop!" Gable shot back. "I'm filing the paperwork at noon." Boone watched. He felt a familiar, ugly tightening in his chest. He hated the mechanics of civilized men. They used paper and numbers to crush people hiding behind ledgers so they didn't have to get their hands bloody. He looked at Clara. She was pale, her face weathered by the wind, but there was a sharp, unyielding angle to her jaw. She was terrified. Boone could see the slight tremor in her left shoulder, but she refused to bow her head. Boone turned back to the counter. Cobb was finishing his tally. $85 for the lot, Jessup." Cobb mumbled, wiping his hands on his apron. Boone didn't reach for the money. He turned and walked across the uneven floorboards toward the flour sacks. The heavy thud of his boots silenced the snickers by the cracker barrel. Gable puffed out his chest, trying to look authoritative as the mountain man loomed over him. "You're in my light, Jessup." Gable said, his voice entirely lacking the bravado he had used on the widow. Boone ignored him. He looked down at Clara. $60 pays the debt," he asked. His voice was gravel, low and rough. Clara's head tilted towards the sound of his voice. She gripped her cane tighter. "Who is speaking?" "Boone Jessup." She swallowed hard. "Yes, Mr. Jessup. $60 clears the county tax and the bank's penalty." Boone turned his massive head toward the bank manager. "Write the receipt." Gable blinked. "What now? See here, Jessup, this is a municipal matter. You don't want to go throwing your trapping money at a lost cause. The land is useless, just rocks and mud." "I didn't ask for a survey," Boone said. He stepped half a pace forward. He didn't raise a hand, but the sheer physical mass of the man made Gable take a quick step back. "I said write the receipt." Gable scrambled to his pocketbook, pulling out a small ledger and a nub of pencil. He scribbled hastily, tore the page out, and handed it to Boone. Boone walked to the counter, took $60 from the pile of notes Cobb had laid out, and dropped it into Gable's trembling hand. "Done," Boone said. Gable scurried out of the store, the bell above the door clanging frantically. The store was dead silent. Boone walked back to Clara. He held out the receipt, realized his mistake, and instead folded it and tucked it into the pocket of her shawl. "Why did you do that?" Clara asked. Her voice was steady but laced with deep suspicion. She wasn't foolish. Men didn't give away $60 out of the goodness of their hearts. "I need a place to winter." Boone lied. He had a cabin up on the ridge. "Your land is on the river. I'll pay my keep in labor. I fix the roof, I chop the wood, you keep the deed." Clara's unseeing eyes scoured his face as if she could read his intentions through the air itself. "I don't need a savior, Mr. Jessup." "Good," Boone said, "because I ain't one. I'm just a man who hates Hiram Gable. We have a deal or not?" She weighed the options. A freezing church cellar or a dangerous mountain man living on her property. She extended a calloused hand. "We have a deal." By the time Friday rolled around, the town of Pine Bluffs had manufactured a new joke. The savage and the blind woman were getting married. It wasn't born out of romance, it was born out of cold, hard logistics. Reverend Miller, a man possessing a severe face and a deeply judgmental heart, refused to let an unmarried man and woman cohabitate on the same plot of land, even if it was just a business arrangement. He threatened to have the sheriff run Boone out of town for indecency. Boone didn't care about the Reverend's morals, but he cared about the sheriff's rifle. Clara cared about keeping her land. So they stood in the drafty vestibule of the Methodist church and spoke words they didn't mean. The pews weren't empty. A dozen townsfolk had shown up. They sat in the back rows, whispering behind their hands. When Boone slipped a simple iron ring bought from the blacksmith for a nickel onto Clara's finger, a man in the back row let out a sharp, barking laugh. It was Jeb Collins, the town drunk. Boone's hand twitched toward the heavy hunting knife on his belt. Clara's fingers clamped down on his wrist. Her grip was startlingly strong. Let them laugh. She whispered, her unseeing eyes fixed straight ahead on the altar. "Breath is cheap. Wood is expensive." They left the church without shaking the Reverend's hand. Boone loaded Clara's few meager belongings into the back of a rented buckboard wagon. The ride to her property was a mile out of town, following the muddy, rutted track alongside the river. The silence between them was dense. Boone drove the horses, his eyes scanning the tree line out of habit. Clara sat rigid on the wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't ask where they were. She listened to the sounds, the rush of the water over the shallows, the change in the wind as they passed through the pine brake. She knew exactly where she was. They pulled up to the homestead. Boone pulled back on the reins and stared. Hiram Gable hadn't been entirely wrong. The place was a ruin. The main cabin was barely standing, its roof sagging under the weight of wet leaves and rot. The door hung off a single rusted hinge. Beyond the cabin, right on the riverbank, sat a massive, half-finished timber frame. It looked like the skeleton of a giant, rotting beast. Thomas Jensen had been trying to build a grist mill before the river took him. "It's a mess," Boone said bluntly. There was no point in sugarcoating it to a woman who couldn't see. "I know," Clara replied. She reached for her cane and carefully climbed down from the wagon before Boone could offer a hand. He unhitched the horses and tied them to a sturdy post. When he turned back, Clara was already walking towards the skeletal remains of the mill. Her cane swept in wide, rhythmic arcs across the dead grass and mud. "Watch your step," Boone called out, jogging toward her. "There's loose timber everywhere with nails sticking out." "I know where the timber is, Boone," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. She didn't slow down. She walked directly up to the massive main support beam of the unfinished mill and placed her bare hand flat against the rough wood. Boone stood a few feet away, crossing his arms. He figured she was grieving, remembering the husband who had failed to finish the job. He decided to let her have her moment. He turned his attention to the cabin. "I'll patch the roof before sundown," Boone said. "Get a fire going inside. It's going to drop below freezing tonight." "Leave the roof," Clara said. Boone paused. "You want to sleep under a leaky roof? The cabin is a temporary shelter," Clara said, her voice dropping, its defensive edge replaced by a quiet intensity. She turned her head toward him. Thomas didn't know what he was doing. He was a good man, but he was a terrible carpenter. He laid the foundation for the mill too close to the flood line. That's why it's rotting. Boone frowned. Then what's the point? Clara reached into the deep pocket of her wool skirt. She pulled out a heavy ball of twine. "Come here," she commanded. Boone walked over. "Take the end of this string," she said. He took it. "Walk exactly 15 paces inland, directly away from the water. Tell me when you hit the granite outcropping." Boone narrowed his eyes, but he turned and walked. His long strides ate up the distance. 14, 15, his boot hit solid, moss-covered rock. "I'm here. Tie the string to the base of the rock, tight." Boone tied it. He looked back. Clara was moving quickly now. She tied her end of the twine to the rusted iron wheel hub her husband had left in the mud. She reached into her pocket again and pulled out another spool of string, this one thicker. For the next hour, Boone watched in absolute silence. He didn't chop wood. He didn't fix the roof. He watched a blind woman map an acre of uneven, debris-littered ground. She used different thicknesses of rope and string. She measured by paces, by arm lengths, by the sound of the river against the rocks. She drove wooden stakes into the ground with a rusted mallet, finding the heads of the stakes purely by touch and muscle memory. By the time the sun dipped behind the western ridge, casting long, bruised shadows over the valley, the patch of mud between the ruined mill and the cabin was covered in a complex geometric web of intersecting ropes. Boone walked up to her as she hammered the final stake. She was breathing hard, her forehead beaded with sweat despite the cold. "What is this?" Boone asked, looking over the grid of twine. Clara stood up, wiping her dirty hands on her apron. She didn't look broken anymore. She looked terrifyingly focused. "This is the new foundation," she said. "The town thinks I'm a helpless widow sitting on a pile of useless timber. But I listened to every mistake Thomas made. I felt every warped board he cut. I spent 3 years in the dark, calculating the angles, the load-bearing weight of the river stone, the exact pitch needed for the water wheel." She reached out and grabbed his thick forearm. Her grip was like iron. "They laughed at you for buying me Boone Jessup. But they don't know what I've been designing in the dark. I'm not building a shack. I'm building a sawmill, the only one within 50 miles, and you are going to help me build it." Boone looked at the intricate web of ropes. It was flawless. It was the floor plan of a massive, structurally perfect building. He looked down at the blind woman standing in the mud. For the first time in 10 years, Boone Jessup smiled. "All right, Mrs. Jessup," Boone said, rolling up his sleeves. "Where do we start?" The rhythm of the axe became the heartbeat of the valley. It started before dawn, when the frost was still thick and white on the dead grass, and it didn't stop until the moon was high enough to cast shadows. Boone swung a double-bitted felling axe with a violent mechanized efficiency. He didn't hack at the timber. He calculated the grain, found the weakness, and drove the steel through the pine with bone-jarring force. Every tree that fell shook the muddy earth. Every crack echoed all the way down to Pine Bluffs. The town heard it. They stood on the boardwalks outside Cobb's mercantile hands, shoved deep into their woolen coat pockets, listening to the distant rhythmic thuds. At first they smiled. They figured the mountain man was just chopping winter firewood. They figured he was building a crude lean-to for the blind woman before the heavy snows buried them both. But the chopping didn't stop. It went on for 2 weeks. Up on the ridge, the homestead was transforming. Boone hauled the massive pine trunks down to the riverbank, using the 2 draft horses. Once the logs were stripped of their branches, Clara took over. She didn't sit in the cabin knitting. She set up a pair of heavy sawhorses in the freezing mud. Boone would guide a stripped log onto the horses, and Clara would run her bare, calloused hands over the rough bark. She felt for knots, for rot, for the natural curve of the wood. Then, taking up a heavy 2-handled draw-knife, she began to peel the log. She worked entirely by touch and sound. The sharp steel shaved the bark away in long, curling ribbons. She knew exactly how deep to bite into the wood by the resistance of the blade and the pitch of the scraping noise. When she needed a timber squared off for a joint, Boone used a broadaxe following the deep, straight grooves Clara scored into the wood with a heavy iron nail. It was a strange, silent choreography. They spoke very little. Words wasted breath, and breath was heat. Boone learned to trust her hands more than his own eyes. If he cut a mortise hole for a joint, Clara would walk over, kneel in the freezing mud, and slide her fingers inside the carved-out pocket. "A 1/4 inch too shallow on the left side," she said one afternoon, pulling her hand back. Her knuckles were raw and bleeding from the cold, but she didn't seem to notice. "The tenon will snap under the weight of the roof if it doesn't sit flush." Boone didn't argue. He didn't let his pride flare up. He took his chisel, shaved away exactly a 1/4 inch of wood on the left side, and stepped back. Clara checked it again. She nodded once. Good. By the 3rd week of November, the skeleton of the new sawmill began to rise. It wasn't the rotting, haphazard frame her dead husband had tried to build. This was a fortress. The primary support columns were 2 feet thick, sunk deep into the granite outcropping Clara had mapped with her string. The joints were locked together with massive oak pegs that Clara carved by the fire at night. The townsfolk couldn't ignore the noise anymore. The curiosity ate at them. On a bitter Tuesday afternoon, Caleb Fowler rode up the rutted wagon trail. Caleb was a young man with more money than sense, whose father owned the livery stable. He sat atop a fine roan gelding a thick wool scarf wrapped around his neck. He pulled up near the perimeter of the property and stared. Boone was 50 feet up in the air, straddling a massive crossbeam, driving an oak peg into a joint with a heavy wooden maul. Clara was on the ground below, operating a complex block and tackle system Boone had rigged to hoist the heavy timbers. Caleb urged his horse a few steps closer. He looked at the massive structure, the sheer scale of the engineering. His jaw hung loose. "What in the hell are you building?" Caleb shouted over the rush of the river. Boone didn't stop swinging the maul. He didn't even look down. Clara turned her head toward the sound of Caleb's voice. She kept her grip tight on the thick hemp rope of the hoist. "A business, Mr. Fowler." Clara said, her voice carrying sharply on the freezing wind. Caleb sneered, recovering his arrogance. "A business. The bank owns this land in 3 weeks, Clara. You're building a barn for Hiram Gable." "The taxes are paid," she replied evenly. "Taxes, maybe. But Gable says your husband took a private loan against the deed before he drowned. $80, due December 1st. Caleb leaned forward in his saddle, enjoying the delivery of the bad news. "Gable didn't mention it at the store. Didn't figure a blind woman could read a contract anyway." The heavy thud of Boone's maul stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. Boone slowly lowered the hammer. He looked down at Caleb. The mountain man's eyes were flat and dark, completely devoid of warmth. Caleb's horse shifted nervously, sensing the sudden shift in the air. "You tell Hiram Gable." Boone said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to vibrate in the timber itself, "that if he steps foot on this claim before December 1st, I will nail his boots to the boardwalk while he's wearing them." Caleb swallowed hard. The sneer vanished. He yanked the reins hard to the left and spurred his horse back toward town, kicking up clods of frozen mud. Boone climbed down from the scaffolding. He dropped the maul into the dirt. He looked at Clara. She was trembling. Not from the cold. "Is it true?" Boone asked. Clara let go of the rope. Her shoulders sagged. "Thomas signed a lot of papers before he died. He was desperate. Gable likely kept the private loan quiet just to humiliate me further. $80. Boone looked out at the freezing river. He had spent his trapping money on the taxes and the iron fittings for the mill. They had exactly $4 left in a tin can under the floorboards. "I'll pack my things," Clara whispered. Defeat finally fractured her voice. "You've worked hard, Boone. Take the horses. Take the tools. Leave me here." Boone walked over to her. He didn't offer comfort. He offered reality. "We need a main axle for the water wheel," Boone said gruffly. "Oak, thick as a whiskey barrel. I saw a stand of old growth 3 miles up the ridge. We cut it tomorrow." Clara lifted her blind eyes toward him. "Did you hear me? We have no money. Gable will take the mill." "Let him try," Boone said. He turned and picked up his broadaxe. "Now grab the other end of this rope. The sun is dropping." The cold moved in like a predator. It didn't just freeze the mud. It sucked the moisture straight out of the air, making every breath feel like inhaling crushed glass. They found the oak tree 3 miles up the ridge. It was a monster hundreds of years old, its roots digging into the mountain like gnarled fingers. Felling it took 2 agonizing days. Stripping it and dragging it down to the river behind the straining draft horses took 3 more. By the time they wrestled the massive oak log onto the riverbank, it was late November. The Snake River was beginning to ice over at the edges, the black water churning violently through the center channel. They had to set the main axle for the water wheel. It was the most dangerous piece of the build. The axle had to be suspended perfectly level over the rushing water, resting in the carved stone cradles Boone had chiseled into the riverbank. It weighed over 1,000 pounds. Boone had constructed a sheer legs derrick, 2 massive poles lashed together at the top, leaning out over the water rigged with the heavy block and tackle. Clara stood back from the muddy bank, her hands gripping the tail end of the hoist rope. The friction burned through her leather work gloves, but she anchored her boots deep in the frozen dirt. "Tension!" Boone yelled over the roar of the rapids. Clara leaned back, throwing her entire body weight against the rope. The pulleys shrieked in protest. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive oak axle lifted off the mud. Boone was down in the icy water, waist-deep, his buckskin soaked and freezing instantly to his skin. He had to guide the suspended log into the stone cradles. The current battered against him, trying to sweep his legs out from under him. His lips were blue, his jaw locked in a rictus of sheer physical exertion. "Lower it!" Boone bellowed, shoving his frozen shoulder against the swinging oak timber. 2 inches. Clara let the rope slip exactly 2 inches. She felt the vibration of the heavy wood humming through the hemp line. Then the iron ring at the apex of the derrick groaned. A sharp, terrifying crack echoed over the water. One of the thick, lashing ropes holding the derrick together snapped under the cold and the weight. The structure shifted violently to the right. The oak axle swung sideways. It hit Boone square in the chest. The breath exploded from his lungs. The impact threw him backward into the freezing, churning black water. "Boone!" Clara screamed. The sound of the timber shifting and the splash was unmistakable. The rope in her hands jerked forward with terrifying force as the load dropped. The friction tore through her gloves, peeling the skin from her palms. If she let go, the axle would crash down, crushing Boone beneath the water. She didn't let go. Clara dropped to her knees in the mud, wrapping the rope around her forearms, burying her boots into the earth. The muscles in her back and shoulders screamed as the entire weight of the 1,000-pound log fought against her. Blood soaked through her ruined gloves, freezing instantly to the coarse hemp. "Boone!" She screamed again, her voice tearing her throat raw. Under the water, Boone was drowning. The cold had paralyzed his lungs. The current dragged him over the jagged rocks. He fought blindly, his heavy boots pulling him down. His hand broke the surface, thrashing against the ice. He felt the rough bark of the suspended oak log. Clara was holding it. A blind woman, 90 pounds soaking wet, was holding 1,000 pounds of dead weight by pure, irrational willpower. Boone grabbed the log. He pulled his head above the black water, gasping a ragged, agonizing breath. He hooked his arm over the timber, fighting the current. "Hold it!" he roared, coughing up river water. He hauled his massive frame up the side of the suspended log. The derrick groaned, leaning dangerously toward collapse. Boone scrambled along the timber, reached the stone cradle, and threw his weight against the end of the axle. "Drop it!" he yelled. Clara let the rope go. The massive oak timber slammed down into the stone cradles with a deafening boom. Water and ice sprayed high into the air. The axle seated perfectly. The iron ring at the top of the derrick shattered the wooden poles, collapsing uselessly into the river. Boone dragged himself out of the freezing water and collapsed onto the muddy bank. He lay flat on his back, staring up at the grey, unforgiving sky, his chest heaving violently. A moment later, Clara was beside him. She dropped to her knees, her hands frantically patting his chest, his face feeling for broken bones. Her breath came in ragged, terrified sobs. "I'm whole," Boone choked out, grabbing her wrists. "I'm whole." He felt the warm stickiness on her hands. He sat up, pushing through the agonizing cold, and pulled her palms toward his face. The leather gloves were shredded. Her hands were a mess of torn skin and raw meat. Boone didn't say a word. He stood up his joints, screaming, picked Clara up in his arms, and carried her to the cabin. He kicked the door shut against the wind. The fire in the hearth was burning low. He set her gently on the narrow wooden bed and stripped off his freezing buckskins before hypothermia set in, wrapping himself in a heavy wool blanket. He found the bottle of cheap whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes and poured a generous measure over a clean rag. He sat beside her on the bed. "This is going to burn," he warned quietly. Clara set her jaw. She held her hands out, palms up. Boone pressed the whiskey-soaked rag into her open wounds. Clara flinched, a sharp hiss escaping her teeth, but she didn't pull away. Boone wrapped her hands carefully in clean strips of linen. His massive, rough hands were startlingly gentle. The silence in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wind howling against the newly patched roof. "You saved my life," Boone said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of fact. Clara kept her blind eyes focused on the fire. "You are the only man in this valley who treats me like I'm not broken. I wasn't going to let the river take you, too." Boone looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the fierce, unyielding architecture of her jawline, the exhaustion carved into the skin around her sightless eyes. He had spent his life running from people, from towns, from the messy entanglements of human weakness. He went to the mountains because the mountains were honest. They killed you with cold and teeth, not with ledgers and lies. But looking at Clara sitting in the dim light with ruined hands and an unbroken spirit, he realized something terrifying. He didn't want to go back to the timberline. "We have an axle," Clara whispered, exhaustion finally pulling her down into the pillows. "We just need $80. Boone reached out and pulled the heavy quilt over her shoulders. "Rest," Boone said quietly. "I'll handle Hiram Gable." Boone left the cabin 2 hours before dawn. The temperature had plummeted overnight, locking the valley in a hard, white freeze. The mud of the wagon trail was solid as iron. He didn't take the horses. He walked. Over his right shoulder he carried his Hawken rifle. It was a heavy percussion cap piece forged in St. Louis. 50-inch octagonal barrel. Curly maple stock polished smooth by years of sweat and handling. Double-set triggers that broke like winter ice. It wasn't just a tool, it was his livelihood. It had dropped charging grizzlies in the bighorns and kept him breathing through winters that starved lesser men. It was worth $150 to the right buyer. Boone marched into Pine Bluffs as the sun crested the eastern ridge, casting long, pale shadows down the main street. The town was just waking up. Chimneys belched grey wood smoke into the still air. He didn't go to Cobb's Mercantile. He walked straight to the small, squat building at the end of the boardwalk. A wooden sign shaped like an anvil hung above the door. Jeremiah Reed, the local gunsmith and blacksmith, was already at his forge, coaxing the coals to life with a heavy leather bellows. Reed looked up as Boone filled the doorway. The blacksmith was a thick, soot-stained man with cautious eyes. He wiped his hands on a filthy apron and nodded. "Jessup," Reed said. "You're down from the ridge early. Broke a mainspring." Boone didn't answer. He walked to the workbench, unslung the Hawken, and laid it down gently on the scarred wood. The steel barrel gleamed dull and cold in the lantern light. Reed stopped pumping the bellows. He walked over, his eyes fixed on the rifle. He reached out, hesitating a moment before running a calloused thumb over the brass patchbox. He knew exactly what he was looking at. Every man in the territory who knew anything about firearms knew a genuine Hawken. "That is a beautiful piece of murder," Reed murmured. He looked up at Boone. "What do you want for it?" $80. Boone said. "Gold or banknotes, no scrip." Reed narrowed his eyes. He knew the rifle was worth nearly double that. He also knew Boone Jessup wouldn't sell his primary weapon unless he was desperate. The town gossip about the widow's debts suddenly made perfect sense. "I can give you 60, Reed tested, tapping the stock. "Hard winter coming. Cash is tight." Boone reached out and grabbed the barrel. 80. Or I walk it to the assayer in Carson City next spring." Reed sighed, realizing the mountain man wasn't in the mood to haggle. He went to a heavy iron strongbox beneath his counter, unlocked it with a key he wore around his neck, and counted out 4 $20 gold eagles. He set them on the bench. Boone picked up the coins. He didn't look at the rifle again. He turned and walked out into the freezing street. The bank didn't open for another hour, so Boone waited on the boardwalk opposite the building. He stood perfectly still, impervious to the biting wind, his massive arms crossed over his chest. People walked past him, giving him a wide berth. They looked at the empty leather sling strapped across his chest. They whispered. At precisely 8 o'clock, Hiram Gable strode down the street. He wore a heavy beaver fur coat and a bowler hat, his face flushed pink from the cold. He unlocked the bank door, stepped inside, and left it propped open to air out the stale smell of the vault. Boone followed him in. Gable was just settling behind his polished mahogany desk when the heavy footfalls made him look up. The smug satisfaction wiped off the banker's face instantly. "Jessup!" Gable stammered, pulling a ledger toward him defensively. "The bank isn't open for transactions yet. And regarding the Jensen property, the deadline is tomorrow. You don't have the capital. I've already drafted the foreclosure." Boone stepped up to the desk. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the 4 gold eagles, and dropped them onto the mahogany. The heavy clack of the coins echoed off the plaster walls. $80, Boone said. "Write the receipt. Mark the loan paid in full." Gable stared at the gold. He looked from the coins to Boone's face, searching for a trick. Finding none, his face flushed a deeper, angrier red. He had wanted the land. He had wanted to see the widow broken. "This doesn't change anything." Gable spat, picking up a pen with a shaking hand. "She can't run a mill blind. You're delaying the inevitable. You'll starve. Write it." Boone growled, leaning heavily on the desk. Gable hastily scribbled the receipt, stamped it, and shoved it across the desk. Boone took the paper, folded it meticulously, and walked out without another word. When Boone returned to the homestead, the sun was high and weak. Clara was outside by the fire pit, a heavy blanket wrapped over her shoulders. Her hands were still thickly bandaged from the rope burns resting uselessly in her lap. She turned her head as Boone's heavy boots crunched on the frozen mud. She listened intently. "You're back," she said softly. "The debt is cleared," Boone said. He pulled the paper from his pocket and pressed it into her bandaged hand. "Gable won't bother you again." Clara ran her thumb over the rough paper. She didn't smile. Her brow furrowed. She listened again, the silence stretching between them. "When you walk, the brass fittings on your rifle sling usually rattle," she said quietly. "I don't hear them, Boone. Where is your Hawken?" Boone looked at the skeletal frame of the mill, the massive oak axle they had nearly died setting into place. He felt naked without the rifle's weight on his shoulder. "It's safe," Boone lied. Clara stood up. She walked toward him, stopping only when her boots bumped against his. She reached up with her bandaged hands, feeling for his shoulder, trailing her fingers down his chest. She found the empty leather sling. She let her hands drop. Her sightless eyes locked onto his face with piercing accuracy. "You sold your life insurance for a blind woman's rotting wood," she whispered. Her voice broke, stripped of its usual iron defense. "I bought a partner," Boone corrected roughly. He stepped past her, grabbing a heavy iron crowbar from the tool pile. "We have a water wheel to build. Daylight is burning." They worked through the darkest days of December. The cold became an active enemy, threatening to crack the iron fittings and snap the brittle pine boards. With her hands bandaged, Clara couldn't hold a tool, but her mind was sharper than any broadaxe. She sat by the frozen riverbank, wrapped in a heavy buffalo robe Boone had draped over her, directing every swing of his hammer. They were building the water wheel. It was an undershot design meant to harness the brutal, fast-moving current of the Snake River, rather than relying on a heavy drop. Boone spent a week cutting and shaping 24 massive wooden paddles. Each paddle had to be angled perfectly notched into the circular rims with agonizing precision. By the end of the second week, the town's curiosity had mutated into resentment. The people of Pine Bluffs didn't like being proven wrong. They had bet on the widow's failure. Now the sprawling, structurally sound silhouette of a functional sawmill loomed over the riverbank. It was a monument to their own lack of charity. On a moonless Thursday night, the resentment arrived at their doorstep. Boone was asleep in the cabin, lying on a bedroll near the hearth. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. Clara was asleep in the narrow bed. Outside, a dry twig snapped. Boone's eyes snapped open. He didn't move. He didn't reach for the Hawken that wasn't there. He slid his hand under his blanket and gripped the bone handle of his hunting knife. Another sound. The heavy, muffled thud of a boot against frozen mud. Near the mill structure. Boone rose silently. He slipped out the back door into the biting night air, melting into the deep shadows cast by the timber piles. Down by the river, 3 men were huddled near the main axle. They carried a lantern, its shutter closed to a narrow slit, casting a weak yellow beam on the wood. One of them held a heavy iron sledgehammer. The other held a rusted can smelling sharply of coal oil. "Just smash the main gear teeth," a voice whispered. It was Jeb Collins, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "Then soak the structural beams. A quick fire, and Gable takes the land for ash value. Shut up and hold the light," another man muttered, raising the sledgehammer. He never completed the swing. Boone stepped out of the dark like a nightmare. He grabbed the sledgehammer midair with his left hand, arresting its momentum completely. The man holding it gasped, looking up into Boone's face. Boone drove the heavy pommel of his hunting knife directly into the man's temple. The man collapsed, instantly hitting the mud without a sound. Jeb Collins stumbled backward, dropping the lantern. The glass shattered the oil, sparking briefly before dying in the snow. Jeb fumbled for a revolver in his coat. Boone closed the distance in a single stride. He grabbed Jeb by the throat, lifting the drunk off his feet, and slammed him against the massive oak axle. Jeb gurgled, clawing frantically at Boone's thick, unyielding arm. The third man took one look at the mountain man, turned, and bolted blindly into the dark tree line, abandoning his friends. Boone leaned in close to Jeb's face. "You tell Gable," Boone whispered, his voice vibrating with pure, lethal intent. "If one spark touches this wood, if one gear breaks, I will come down to Pine Bluffs. I won't use a knife. I will use my bare hands on his neck. Nod if you understand." Jeb nodded frantically, his eyes bulging. Boone dropped him into the mud. Jeb scrambled backward, dragged his unconscious friend up by the collar, and staggered away into the night, sobbing. 2 days later, the mill was ready. It was a bleak, overcast morning. The river was choked with chunks of drifting ice. The massive wooden wheel hung suspended above the current, the sluice gate locked tight, holding back the freezing water. Inside the mill house, Clara stood next to the main drive gear. Her hands, freed from the bandages, but heavily scarred with raw red lines, rested lightly on the massive wooden teeth. She felt the tension in the air. Boone stood outside by the sluice gate, holding a heavy iron pry bar. "Ready!" Boone shouted over the roar of the river. "Pull the gate!" Clara yelled back. Boone jammed the pry bar under the locking wedge. He threw his weight against it. The wood shrieked. The wedge popped free. The sluice gate dropped. A torrent of black, icy water rushed through the chute. It slammed into the wooden paddles of the water wheel with the force of a freight train. The entire structure groaned. The ground beneath their feet shuddered violently. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The friction of the frozen grease and the sheer weight of the machinery fought against the river. Then the massive oak axle let out a deafening crack that sounded like a cannon shot. Inside, Clara gasped, pulling her hands back as the drive gear jerked violently. The wheel turned. It was slow at first, a brutal, agonizing grind of wood against wood. But as the momentum built, the river won. The massive wheel began to rotate steadily, the paddles churning the icy water into a white froth. Inside the mill house, the mechanical heart of Clara's design woke up. The drive gear caught the secondary shaft. A cacophony of rhythmic clacking and grinding filled the cavernous space. The massive carriage sled, designed to push logs through the blade, lurched forward along its tracks. Boone walked into the mill house. He watched the massive circular saw blade purchased with the last of his trapping money months ago spin up to speed. It became a terrifying blur of singing steel. Clara stood in the center of the noise. The sheer volume of the machinery was deafening, but she didn't cover her ears. She reached out and placed her scarred hand flat against the vibrating oak wall of the mill. She felt the raw mechanical power humming through the wood. She felt the steady, flawless rhythm of the gears she had calculated in the dark. A slow, brilliant smile broke across her face. It was the first time Boone had ever seen her truly smile. "Throw a log on the carriage, Mr. Jessup!" Clara yelled over the roar of the saw. "We have timber to cut." The scream of the massive circular saw blade biting into old-growth pine became the new anthem of the valley. It was a violent, beautiful noise. It drowned out the wind. It drowned out the roar of the river. Boone worked the heavy iron levers of the carriage sled. He fed a 12-foot lodgepole pine into the spinning steel teeth. Sawdust exploded into the air, a thick, fragrant cloud of raw sap and fresh timber. The blade sliced through the log with hungry efficiency, spitting out a perfectly straight, rough-sawn board onto the exit rollers. Clara stood at the end of the line. The noise was absolute, isolating her in a world of vibration. She reached out. Her scarred hands found the warm, freshly cut wood. She ran her fingertips along the broad, flat face, then down the sharp 90-degree edge. She didn't need eyes to see the quality. The kerf was perfectly uniform. The thickness was exact. The board didn't bow or twist. The geometry of her mill was flawless. Boone locked the carriage and walked over his face coated in a fine layer of pale yellow sawdust. He watched Clara trace the grain of the wood. Her face held a fierce, quiet triumph. She turned towards the heavy thud of his boots. "It's straight," she said, raising her voice over the idling hum of the mill machinery. "Quarter-inch tolerance at most. Better than the steam mills in Carson City." Boone confirmed. He grabbed the board and tossed it onto the growing stack outside the mill house. "We have 50 boards cut. Give it another week, we'll have a mountain." "We don't need a mountain," Clara replied, stepping out into the biting winter air to escape the noise. "We just need a buyer, and they will come." She was right. The brutal winter proved to be the best salesman they could have hired. 3 days later, the heavy snows collapsed the rear roof of Cobb's Mercantile. The weight of the ice shattered the old joists, leaving half of Elias Cobb's dry goods exposed to the elements. Cobb needed lumber, and he needed it before the next blizzard ruined his inventory. Cobb rode up the rutted trail on a sway-backed mule, his face pinched with cold and anxiety. He found Boone splitting cordwood near the cabin, a heavy maul rising and falling in a rhythmic, terrifying display of raw power. Cobb cleared his throat. "Jessup." Boone didn't break his rhythm. He brought the maul down, splitting a thick round of oak in half before turning to look at the storekeeper. He said nothing. "I need timber," Cobb muttered, shifting uncomfortably under the mountain man's flat stare. 20 heavy joists, 100 feet of planking. How much?" Boone leaned the maul against the chopping block. "I don't sell the wood. Talk to the boss." He pointed toward the mill. Clara was sitting on a freshly cut stump, weaving a new, heavy rope from hemp fibers. Cobb swallowed his pride and walked over. "Clara." Cobb started trying to sound neighborly. "Terrible weather we're having. I caught a bad break. Roof caved in." Clara didn't stop weaving. "I heard. It's a shame about your flour sacks, Elias." Cobb bristled slightly. "I need lumber. I know you've been cutting. I'll pay fair market price. 3 cents a board foot." Clara paused. She tilted her head, listening to the wind cut through the pines. 6 cents, she said evenly. Cobb choked. 6, that's robbery. The steam mill in the county seat charges 4. Then take your mule ride 50 miles through a blizzard to the county seat and buy it for 4. Clara said. Her voice held zero malice. It was purely transactional. "But if you want the wood today, it's 6 cents a foot. plus a $10 delivery fee because Boone has to hitch the draft horses in the snow. Cobb's face turned purple. He looked back at Boone, who was casually leaning against a pile of wood, picking his teeth with a splinter. There was no help coming from that direction. Cobb thought of his exposed sugar and coffee, the hundreds of dollars in ruined inventory if he didn't patch the roof by nightfall. "Fine," Cobb spat. "You'll have a bank draft by noon." "No drafts," Clara countered. "Gold or silver. I don't trust Hiram Gable's paper. And Elias—" Cobb stopped, turning back with a glare she couldn't see. "What? I want the winter coat you have in the window display. The heavy wool one with the badger fur collar. Throw that in and Boone leaves in 10 minutes. Cobb practically marched back to his mule, cursing under his breath. Boone walked over to Clara. He looked down at the blind woman, a slow grin spreading beneath his thick beard. She had just ruthlessly extorted the man who had laughed at her 3 months ago. 6 cents? Boone asked. He would have paid 8. Clara replied, picking up her hemp fibers again. But I didn't want to seem greedy. Boone chuckled. It was a deep, gravelly sound that startled the horses. He reached out his massive hand, surprisingly gentle, as he brushed a stray wood shaving from her shoulder. "I'll hitch the wagon," he said. For the first time since they had taken their hollow vows in the church vestibule, the gesture felt like a promise. Clara leaned slightly into his touch, the cold winter air suddenly feeling entirely manageable. By late February, the bitter freeze broke, giving way to a muddy, vicious thaw. The river swelled with snow melt, turning the water wheel with terrifying mechanical fury. The mill ran 12 hours a day. The stack of cured lumber beside the riverbank grew to towering proportions. Wagons from neighboring valleys began to brave the muddy trails bypassing Pine Bluffs entirely to buy directly from the Jensen Jessup mill. Clara's iron-fisted pricing and the undeniable quality of Boone's cuts made them an absolute necessity. Hiram Gable was suffocating. The bank manager had relied on the town's isolation to control its economy. He issued the loans, he set the rates, and he foreclosed when the harsh mountain life inevitably broke the settlers. But Clara was injecting hard currency into the valley. People were buying lumber to build better barns, reinforcing their homes against the weather and bypassing Gable's exorbitant loan terms. Gable decided to stop the bleeding. On a grey Tuesday morning, Gable rode up to the mill. He didn't come alone. He brought a man from the county seat, a hulking, grim-faced deputy named Hayes, who wore a silver star pinned to a heavy buffalo coat. They dismounted by the main trail, their boots sinking deep into the spring mud. Boone was sharpening the main saw blade, a massive, tedious job that required filing every individual tooth by hand. He heard the horses approaching. He set the heavy iron file down and stepped out of the mill house. Clara was already standing outside the cabin, her hickory cane planted firmly in the mud. "Clara," Gable called out, his voice carrying an edge of desperate authority. "Call off your dog. We are here on county business." Boone didn't run, but his long strides closed the distance in seconds. He positioned himself squarely between Gable and Clara. He didn't carry a firearm, but his sheer physical presence made Deputy Hayes drop a hand to the heavy Colt revolver strapped to his hip. "State your business and get off my claim," Boone rumbled. Gable pulled a folded legal document from his coat. "It's an injunction, Jessup, signed by a circuit judge. You are illegally damming a navigable waterway." Clara stepped out from behind Boone's wide back. "The Snake River isn't navigable above the gorge, Hiram. You know that. It's white water and rocks." "The judge disagrees," Gable sneered. "The water wheel violates downstream water rights. The mill has to shut down immediately pending a federal survey. And since that will take until next spring, you are out of business." He shoved the paper toward Boone. Boone didn't take it. He couldn't read well enough to decipher legal jargon, but he knew a trap when he saw one. He looked at Deputy Hayes. "You fixing to enforce this paper?" Boone asked, his voice dropping an octave. Hayes drew his revolver. The metallic click of the hammer locking back cut through the roar of the river. "I am. Step away from the machinery. We're chaining the sluice gate." Boone's muscles coiled. He calculated the distance. He could clear the space and break the deputy's wrist before the man could squeeze the trigger, but there was a risk of a stray bullet hitting Clara. "Wait," Clara said. Her voice cut through the tension like a whip. She tapped her cane against the mud. "Read the bottom of the injunction, Deputy. The legal description of the property." Hayes frowned, keeping the gun leveled at Boone while glancing down at the paper Gable held. "Section 4, Township 9, Range 12. "Stop," Clara commanded. "That's Thomas's original plot, the 50 acres by the road. The plot you claimed for back taxes, Hiram." Gable smiled a nasty, triumphant twisting of his lips. "Exactly. The mill sits on it." "No, it doesn't," Clara said. She took 3 steps forward, pointing her cane directly at a massive granite outcropping 50 yards away. "When Thomas laid the first foundation, he was an idiot. He built on the mudflat. But when Boone and I laid the new foundation, we moved it 15 paces inland, away from the river." She turned her unseeing eyes toward Gable. "We didn't build on Section 4. We built on Section 5, the rocky, worthless ridge that nobody bothered to claim. I filed the homestead papers on Section 5 the day after Boone paid off my debt. Sent it by courier to the land office." Gable's face went completely slack. The blood drained from his cheeks. "The mill isn't on your foreclosed land, Hiram." Clara continued, her voice cold and relentless. "It's on federal land deeded to Clara and Boone Jessup. Your injunction is for an empty patch of mud. You have no jurisdiction. You have no claim." Deputy Hayes looked at Gable. "Is she right?" Gable stammered, looking frantically at the granite outcropping, then back to the mill. The precise, calculated placement of the massive structure suddenly made horrifying sense. She hadn't just moved it for structural integrity. She had moved it to blindside him legally. "Get off my property," Boone said. He took one deliberate step toward the deputy. Hayes looked at the mountain man, then down at his gun. He realized how utterly pointless the weapon was against a man who looked ready to tear him apart with his bare hands. The deputy carefully uncocked the revolver and slid it back into its holster. "This is a local dispute, Gable," Hayes muttered, stepping back toward his horse. "I'm not getting killed over a bad survey." Gable stood, paralyzed in the mud. He looked at the blind widow. He finally saw the trap she had built in the dark, weaving it together with string and patience while the whole town laughed at her. "You won't survive the year." Gable spat weakly, though the venom had completely left his voice. "We already survived the winter," Clara said. She turned her back on him and began walking toward the mill. "Boone, fire up the boiler. We have timber to cut." By May, the valley bloomed, but the most significant change wasn't the wildflowers. It was the sheer volume of traffic. The muddy wagon trail leading up to the Jessup claim was now a hard-packed, deeply rutted road, pounded flat by the constant rolling of heavy freight wagons. Pine Bluffs had fundamentally shifted. The center of commerce was no longer Hiram Gable's mahogany desk. It was the churning water wheel on the river. People who had laughed in the drafty pews of the Methodist church now stood ankle-deep in sawdust, holding their hats in their hands, waiting to speak with Clara. She conducted business from a heavy oak chair Boone had built for her set, right outside the mill doors. She didn't hold grudges. Grudges were an emotional luxury and bad for the ledger. But she didn't offer discounts either. When Reverend Miller needed siding for the church expansion, he paid exactly what Elias Cobb paid, 6 cents a foot. He tried to appeal to her Christian charity, his voice dripping with forced humility. Clara simply tapped her cane against the floorboards and reminded him of the freezing, damp cellar he had offered her when the bank came calling. He paid in silver, The operation had grown too large for just the two of them. They had to hire men. Men who used to sneer at Boone's buckskins and whisper about Clara's blindness now lined up for a daily wage. Boone didn't oversee them with a whip or a loud voice. He managed them with sheer terrifying competence. If a man complained a log was too heavy, Boone would walk over shoulder it alone and point down the road towards town. Nobody complained twice. One late afternoon after the last wagon rolled down the hill and the hired hands had cleared out the mill, finally fell silent. The river rushed by, a constant soothing roar compared to the mechanical violence of the circular saw. Boone was wiping down the massive iron drive gears with a grease rag. He was exhausted. It was a good deep ache in his bones that felt like honest labor. He had a roof that didn't leak a fire that didn't die, and a woman who possessed a spine made of forged iron. He heard Clara's hickory cane tapping against the floorboards. She was walking toward him from the cabin, but her gait was different. Slower. Burdened. He stepped out from under the carriage sled. She was holding something long and heavy wrapped tightly in a thick wool blanket. The stagecoach came through from Carson City today, Clara said. She stopped a few feet away, listening for the heavy scrape of his boots to pinpoint his exact location. I sent an order down with the driver 3 weeks ago. Boone wiped his greasy hands on his canvas trousers. We don't need parts. The gears are holding fine. It's not parts. She held the heavy bundle out. Boone took it. He knew the weight before he even peeled back the wool. The familiar metallic scent of gun oil and polished curly maple hit the air. He unwrapped the blanket. His Hawken rifle. The brass patchbox gleamed in the fading evening light. There was not a single scratch on the barrel. It was perfectly maintained. Boone stared at the weapon. He looked up at Clara. Jeremiah Reed wouldn't sell this back for less than $150. He knew what it was. He sold it for $200. Clara said, her voice perfectly steady. I told him to take it out of the bank draft I got from the railroad agents yesterday. They're laying new track up north through the pass. They bought our entire summer yield. Boone ran his rough thumb over the percussion hammer. The metal was cold, familiar, and lethal. It was a piece of him he thought he had buried for good to pay Hiram Gable's extortion. He swallowed hard. The mountain man who could stare down a charging grizzly without a flinch felt a sudden terrifying tightness in his throat. You didn't have to do that. Boone rasped, his voice thicker than usual. The mill needs the capital for winter. Clara stepped closer. She reached out her heavily scarred hands, finding his chest moving past his heavy suspenders until they rested squarely over his heart. The mill has capital, she said softly. The mill has a foundation. I wanted my husband to have his rifle. Boone looked down at her. She wasn't a fragile thing needing protection. She was steel and pine and sheer unbroken will. He set the heavy rifle down on the workbench. He reached out and took her face in his massive, calloused hands. He didn't ask. He just leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, polite thing. It was fierce and grounded tasting of sawdust sweat and survival. Clara's cane clattered loudly to the wooden floorboards. She reached up her hands, tangling in his thick, unruly beard, pulling him closer, anchoring herself against his unyielding mass. When they finally broke apart, the sun was dipping below the tree line, painting the sky in brutal shades of bruised purple and gold. Boone kept his forehead pressed against hers, breathing in the scent of pine resin and cold river water that clung to her skin. They thought we'd freeze. Boone whispered, his voice a low rumble. Clara smiled, her sightless eyes facing the horizon she didn't need to see to own. Let them freeze, she said. We have fire to build. They stood together in the quiet twilight, two castaways who had taken a patch of worthless mud and built an empire. The town of Pine Bluffs was down in the valley, wrapped in its petty squabbles and debts. Up on the ridge the wheel turned, the river rushed, and the mountain man held the blind widow, knowing for the first time in his life he was exactly where he belonged. And that is how the wild is truly tamed, not with paper and greed, but with iron sweat and an unbreakable will. Clara and Boone didn't just build a mill, they built a legacy over the ashes of their doubters. If this story of vengeance, grit, and hard-earned love got your blood pumping, don't let it end here. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a real frontier tale, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Let us know in the comments what was your favorite moment of Clara's revenge. See you next time.